مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الوقت يمر، أيام قليلة تفصلنا عن موعد الانتخابات التشريعية في الولايات المتحدة. إنها أيام وليست أسابيع أو أشهر. يتنافس الجمهوريون والديمقراطيون للسيطرة على مجلسي الكونغرس. حزب الرئيس بايدن يسيطر حاليا على مجلسي النواب والشيوخ معا، وخسارة أي واحد منهما سيشكل عقبة هائلة للبيت الأبيض على مدى العامين القادمين. أما فوز الحزب الجمهوري في أي من المجلسين سيزيد الحزب بالحماس والحيوية قبل الانتخابات الرئاسية التالية في عام 2024. في هذه المرحلة من الانتخابات على المرشحين أن يختاروا، فهل يحاولوا إقناع مجموعة تزداد تكلفاً من الناخبين الحائرين، أم يحرصون على قيام مؤيديهم الأوفياء بالتصويت في يوم الانتخاب؟ بعبارة أخرى، هل يزيد المرشحون قدرتهم على اجتذاب ناخبين جدد، أم يقومون بتقوية قاعدة المؤيدين الحالية؟ فمن الصعب القيام بالأمرين في الوقت نفسه. لمناقشة الاستراتيجيات الانتخابية في الأيام الأخيرة للحملة، يسرني أن أستضيف اثنين من أذكى الخبراء في السياسة، نورم أورنستين وكايل كونديك. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Well, we're almost there. We're on what is called in horse racing the home stretch. This is the final few weeks before the American elections, our legislative or congressional elections, also called off-year elections. And to discuss what it means to be an off-year election and how these are distinguished from our on-year or presidential elections, I'm delighted to welcome two of the smartest guys in politics, Norm Ornstein and Kyle Kondik. Thank you both very much for joining me today. So, Norm, what makes an off-year election unique? How is it different than an on-year or presidential election?
So the way our elections have been structured, every 4 years there's a presidential election. Also, at that time, the election of all the members of the House of Representatives, 435 of them, and a third of the Senate, 6-year terms that are staggered. The off years have another third of the Senate, and again, all 435 members of the House, plus, by the way, most of the elections for governors in our states and for most of the state legislatures. What makes it unique is that the usual pattern, doesn't happen always, but it happens most of the time, is that the president's party suffers losses. There are a lot of reasons for this, Rob. Many years ago, decades ago, there was a seminal paper by political scientists at the University of Michigan called Surge and Decline, that there's a big turnout in a presidential election, often working in the direction of the person who gets elected president. And many of those voters don't turn out in the midterms. It's not as exciting. And that means the president's party suffers as a consequence. What also happens, Rob, is that the partisans of the president who are really excited when he wins, especially if the party wins the House and Senate, is we're going to get everything we want, and they never do, and they're disappointed, and the out party is upset because it's worse than they thought. So the consequences then become very significant. Will the president have enough people in his own party to be able to implement more of his policies? Will he face divided government and hostility? And it's even more of an issue now because the Republican Party has grown more and more radical and hostile to any of the actions that a Democrat might take.
All right, so Kyle, can you remind our viewers generally the percentages of Americans who vote in presidential elections versus the percentages that vote in these off-year elections, and why off-year elections tend to focus on the base of the two parties?
Yeah, so we've actually had two straight pretty high turnout elections, both the 2018 midterm and then the 2020 presidential. 2020 presidential was about 2/3 of the eligible people who were eligible to vote who showed up to vote, which was really a historically high number, sort of a modern record. And it was also high for the midterm in 2018, but it was only about 50% of those eligible who showed up, which is still high for a midterm. It's often been in the 40s or even in the 30s in terms of turnout. 4 years before 2018 and 2014, it was in the 30s. And so there's a lot of interest, I think, in politics right now. Now, I guess if you compare our turnout to turnout in other countries, you probably would find it to be fairly low. But relatively speaking, we've had higher turnout recently. I do think in the midterm, the opposition party, the party that doesn't hold the White House, they do, as Norm mentioned, often they do better in the midterm than maybe they did in the past presidential race, and the president's party struggles a little bit. I think there can often be sort of a motivation advantage for the opposition party. Anger, I think, can be a pretty good motivator for people to show up and vote, and usually the opposition party has more to be angry about. One thing that's been a little bit different this time is we have seen Democratic enthusiasm, the president's party, go up, I think, because a lot of Democrats are angry about the recent Dobbs Supreme Court decision that did away with the Roe v. Wade decision, did away with robust federal protections for abortion rights. But as much as we focus on the base, it's important to note that independents matter too. They don't pay as much attention to politics as hard partisans do. They also don't turn out at the same kind of rates. And sometimes independent voters, they may be undecided, and sometimes the decision they make is just not to show up at all. So it could be kind of hard to figure out exactly how those kinds of voters are going to show up. But a lot of those people are probably cross-pressured in this election because they probably don't have a particularly high or good view of President Biden, whose approval rating has been broadly negative and negative with independents. But a lot of those voters may not also have a particularly positive impression of the Republican Party. Usually you'd expect those folks to break against the White House. But there's some signs that maybe that's not happening, which has made this, I think, kind of an interesting and different kind of midterm than some of the recent ones we've had.
Interesting. And so, Norm, a couple of questions that Kyle's comment triggers. For these elections, do voters tend to vote their local races, their legislative, their congressional Senate race and their candidates, or do they tend to vote on the grand national zeitgeist issues for or against the president, for or against the opposition party? What's the trend?
So one thing to keep in mind, Rob, is that we have a very tribalized political system now. And we've had a lot of political science research that suggests that what drives voters is negative partisanship. It's hostility towards the other party, a belief that they are evil and trying to destroy our way of life. We're seeing more straight ticket voting in general, which is another reason why, as Kyle said, those independents matter. And right now, I think we're seeing people who vote more just on the basis of the fact that he or she is one of our tribe and not one of theirs, and we can't give them a victory. And just to pick an example or two out of that, Republicans have nominated some candidates for the Senate who are utterly unqualified or cringeworthy in many respects. The best example of that is Herschel Walker, a former star professional football player running for the Senate in Georgia. He has shown that he can't string two coherent sentences together, but he also has lied about his own record, said he was a valedictorian and number one in his class at the University of Georgia, which was not the case, that he's had 4 children by 4 different women and didn't tell the truth about that. And now we've had a revelation that he, while opposing all abortions, actually had an abortion that he paid for with a woman who he said he didn't even know her, and it turns out she had one of his 4 illegitimate children. And I mention all of that because normally that would be a disqualifying set of characteristics. But he is in a highly competitive race and may well prevail in the state of Georgia. We have a similar issue with the candidate for the Senate in Pennsylvania, a man well known in the country as Dr. Oz, who has his own set of serious issues, but he also is in a competitive race. So what we're seeing is that those tribal identities matter. What matters as much as anything is, just as Kyle said, it's who's going to turn out and what will motivate them to turn out. And the kicker in this midterm election really is that abortion decision by the Supreme Court. If we had been talking about this 6 months ago, Rob, we would probably be talking about a rout, Democrats really losing badly at most levels. For a while, we were talking about the possibility that Democrats could actually do very, very well. Now, as we get closer to the election, we're seeing those partisan and tribal identities settle in a little bit more, and we don't know exactly what the outcome will be. And remember, the Democrats at this point have a 4 or 5 seat margin in the House of Representatives out of 435. It won't take very much to lose that majority, and the Senate is tied at 50-50. So every one of these races at the margins matters enormously.
So, Kyle, if the country is as divided tribally as Norm suggests, you referred earlier to the independents and the undecideds. In historical terms, how big is that group? And when you look at it today, is it just has it shrunk? Like, what percentage of people today are truly undecided?
It's hard to measure, and you could look at it in different kinds of ways. And so if you ask just people, what's your party identification? Usually it's like few more Democrats than Republicans. And then you've got a block of like 35% or something in the electorate. Again, it varies from time to time, that calls themselves independent. However, if you drill down on and you say, hey, you say you're an independent, but do you lean toward one party or the other? A lot of those people will admit that they do lean toward one party or the other. And then the true number of independents becomes more like 10 to 15%. And then, you look at these like polls in various races, often there's like 80 to even 90% of people who respond, they say they're going to back one or the other candidate. And then you've got this mix of undecideds, or maybe a handful of people who say they're voting third party. Usually polls will overstate the percentage of people who actually vote third party, because a lot of those people will come home at the end. They feel like, rightly or wrongly, that they're better off using their vote on one of the 2 major party candidates who actually have a chance to win the race. Although the third parties can be important in some of these places, like we mentioned the Senate race in Georgia, which is one of the high profile races this year. If no one gets 50% in the first round in Georgia, this is not true in many states, but it isn't true in Georgia, there would be a runoff. Some may remember that there were 2 Senate runoffs in Georgia 2 years ago that the Democrats ended up winning. That runoff would be in December, not in January, based on some recent changes in Georgia law. I think the way to look at this is that most people, the lion's share of people, have pretty consistent partisanship, but there are shifts that happen. And I think sometimes we can even understate how significant that is, because there are parts of the country that have really changed a lot over the past 10 years or so. You have seen some places that were kind of more working class, lower 4-year college attainment, that were Democratic in the past. They've sort of shifted more toward the Republicans, sometimes in sort of dramatic ways. And you've seen a lot of affluent college education communities across the country, suburban places, used to be pretty Republican, are now Democratic. And so there's a lot of people who are stable, but there are a lot of changes happening sort of under the hood of American politics, every 4 years and even every 2 years.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to take this fascinating seminar in American political science, and we're going to apply it to a handful of the key races that will determine control of the United States Senate in our November vote. In just a moment. Great nations don't just hold parades for themselves, patting themselves on the back for their greatness. Truly great nations take a close look at themselves, assess what they did right and what they did wrong, and vow to do better. A new documentary film by the greatest living maker of documentary films, Ken Burns, is doing just that. It is a searing 6-hour exploration of America and the Holocaust, based on an exhibit at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum of the same name. What did we know? When did we know it? Did we do everything we could to save the innocent? from the story of Anne Frank and her family, who were denied visas to enter America and ended up murdered at Auschwitz, to the debate over whether the Pentagon was right or wrong to reject proposals to bomb the death camps, America and the Holocaust asks painful but necessary questions that may seem about the past, but as we face horrors in Ukraine, China, Burma, and elsewhere, are as much about the present. To understand the full story of our experience with inhumanity, watch this film. Again, my guests today include Norman Ornstein. Norm is Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and one of America's wisest experts on politics, Congress, and the presidency. A native of the great state of Minnesota, he's a contributing editor and columnist for National Journal and The Atlantic magazines, and an election analyst for BBC News. Also joining us is Kyle Kondik. Kyle is managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia's Center for Politics, and he is the author of The Bellwether, a book about Ohio's presidential voting history, a state that frequently reflects the mood of the American electorate in correctly predicting national election outcomes. All right, well, Kyle, why don't we start with Ohio, a very important Senate race that pits a popular author turned hard right Republican against a fairly progressive Democrat. Tell us a bit about Ohio.
Yes, Ohio has definitely trended right in recent years, which basically made my book obsolete, although the history is what it is. But certainly in 2016 and 2020, Ohio shifted to be sort of clearly more Republican than the nation. So you've got this open Senate seat in Ohio, and Ohio's another place where it seems like the polling has generally kind of underestimated Republicans, at least in the past few cycles. You can't always guarantee whether that'll continue or not in a future election. But this race has been probably more close and competitive and expensive than a lot of people, myself included, thought. J.D. Vance has turned out to be, I think, kind of a weaker candidate. He never really quite pivoted to the center in the general election, which is so often what candidates end up doing. He won a pretty divisive kind of hard right primary several months ago. And Tim Ryan, a longtime Democratic congressman from the Youngstown area. Youngstown is one of those places that has really trended toward, or the greater Youngstown area has trended toward Republicans in recent years. It had a strong Democratic legacy going back to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, but that kind of eroded, particularly with Donald Trump taking over the Republican Party in 2016. And so Ryan is trying to claw back some of those voters and build kind of restore a little bit of Democratic strength, or at least not be quite so weak in kind of small town, rural Ohio, but then also do quite well in Ohio's big metropolitan areas. Polling has generally shown that Ryan is either tied or leading. I think there's reason to be skeptical of that. I kind of still think Vance is going to win in the end, but if you're looking for kind of like sleeper Senate races, Ohio's a good one to look at, and it's certainly one that Republicans certainly cannot afford to lose if they want to win the Senate majority.
And Norm, you mentioned earlier two other Senate races that were marquee races, as it were, both Pennsylvania and Georgia. Let's take a moment, if you will, to focus on Pennsylvania, which pits, as you said, this celebrity doctor against a pretty progressive and unusual Democratic candidate.
You know, it's interesting. Tim Ryan in Ohio and the Democratic candidate, who's the lieutenant governor, John Fetterman, are both running as working class guys, working class populists in a way.
So the stakes are high, the issues we've just laid out, and some of the key races we've taken a close look at. Kyle Kondik, Norm Ornstein, thank you very much for joining us this week on Dackle, Washington. Candidates for office, whether running to be elementary school class monitor or president of the United States, have used tricks, stunts, and skullduggery to win elections since the dawn of time. They spread rumors about their opponents, hand out leaflets with false or defamatory information, get a journalist to run a fabricated story about corruption, infidelity, or some other embarrassment, put another candidate with the same name as their opponent on the ballot to siphon away votes, post a doctored video on some independent website, or dig up some personal item from years ago that may have no bearing on whether the opposing candidate today is fit to serve in the elected position. All of this comes with the territory of being a politician. They need thick skins, effective rapid response teams, and families that can take the heat when the going gets rough. But the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, a Republican, has taken dirty tricks to an entirely new level. As a way to highlight his claim that Northern liberals don't take seriously the threat of illegal immigration, a problem that weighs down border states that have to deal with the flood of people coming across America's southern frontier, he deluded groups of illegal immigrants from Latin America, from Venezuela, Mexico, and elsewhere, into getting on airplanes that flew them to Martha's Vineyard, a small resort island off the coast of Massachusetts, frequented by wealthy liberals, such as the Obamas, the Kennedys, and other members of the progressive elite. It was a stunningly cynical ploy to use real people, moms, dads, children, as props to score political points. As it turned out, the stunt seemed to backfire. The people of Martha's Vineyard welcomed the stunned migrants, provided them food and shelter, and generally took care of them in a warm, welcoming way. Before long, when it was clear that they were no longer of political value, they were flown back to the southern border state from which they came. Now, immigration is a serious issue with many different aspects. Presidents have only nibbled at the edges of this for years, but they haven't really tackled it. Americans themselves are of multiple minds about this. We need immigrants to fuel our labor force, but we don't like the absence of rules, indeed the breaking of rules, that allows millions to come without proper authorization. And yes, the burden does often fall disproportionately on border states, but then they are often the states that benefit from lower cost labor that new immigrants can provide. These are complex issues worthy of a serious national debate. And it's also an issue that concerns real people. As I said, mothers, fathers, children, a fact that is often lost in the bureaucratic and political noise. Yes, stake a position, fight for it. Do recognize that the other side has legitimate concerns too, and work to find solutions. But along the way, let's not use innocent people, many of whom came to America fleeing dictatorship, drug gangs, and violent cartels. Let's not use them as pawns in a broader political campaign. Frankly, as much as it may seem part of an American tradition, it's really not the American way. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن العلاقة بين المال والسياسة في أمريكا، تواصلوا معي رجاءً عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.